Okay, thank you everybody for joining and a Freilich and Chanukah. This is usually a shir on Tefillah, but tonight we are going to take a break since we don't actually even say Tachnon. We're up to Tachnon. Since we don't even say Tachnon on Chanukah, I didn't want to spend time on the Chanukah liturgy, on the Tachnon liturgy tonight. And B'ezrat Hashem next week, we will continue with the our discussion of Tachnun. However, tonight I wanted to, just for fun, knock out a small shiur on some Chanukah myths and certain uh, legends and common misconceptions about Hanukkah that I felt many people have and are just worth covering. They're a lot of fun, and I think we'll have a good time in this short shiur. So let's start with, we're going to do five myths tonight. We're going to run through five different Hanukkah myths. And um, here we go. And we're going to begin with number one. I hope we all have fun with this tonight. Number one, the dreidel story. This one is probably the most fun. Everybody knows the custom of playing dreidel on Hanukkah. And frankly, the actual history of the die itself of this little toy is not difficult to find. This is essentially a German teetotum. It's a gambling toy. The Germans had them with Nimm zwei, Geb eins. They would have them with an N and a G. And the Yiddish versions had a Nun and a Gimel and a Hey and a Shin. They were essentially German teetotums, German gambling toys. And frankly, holiday time in Europe, whether you were in Ireland or England or Germany, holiday time when the nights were long was a gambling time. It was seasonal. And the Jews were unfortunately no exception to this craze, and they also used and gambled during this season. And we find cherems and rabbinical reprimandings from all across the board in the past 500 years. In the 1600s, we have cherem. In the 1500s, we have poskim talking about it, that nobody should be, the rabbis are very upset. Nobody should be playing, should be gambling in Klal Yisrael. It's a terrible thing. They single out dice and cards and backgammon and even chess, but they make an exception for chess. And so the history of why people play dreidel on Hanukkah is in and of itself well understood. I mean, this is not difficult information to find. It was a gambling season in Europe, and the Jews also gambled. It was part of the fun of that time of the year. Now, it wasn't until the Din of Rebbe, the Bnei Yisachar, came around that it gained any kind of sanctity. Up until then, the whole dreidel thing was a bit of an embarrassing. It's not a part of our history that we were proud of. I mean, it was a cultural thing, and you didn't find it in the Arab lands. And frankly, it wasn't a part of the Jewish history that anybody was proud of until the Din of Rebbe came around, the Bnei Yisachar, and he found all sorts of meaning in the dreidel story. And he reinterpreted Nun Gimel Hin Shein not to mean, Nim Zwei or Gebeins or Stellein. He interpreted it with the gematrias. Nun Gimel Hey Shin had gematrias. He compared the Grager to the dreidel, how one is the Taruta de Leila, the other is Taruta de Tata, and he found all sorts of meaning in the dreidel game. So the reception to that was mixed, of course. You had the Litvaks on the one hand who thought it was lunacy. You had the Hasidim who thought it was brilliant. And it depends what side of the aisle you're on today. And this part of the dreidel story is a fairly well understood part of the dreidel's history. What's not so well understood is the dreidel story. Where does the dreidel story come from? Where is the dreidel story that they teach in Cheder that once upon a time the Greeks were learning Torah? The Jews were learning Torah, and the Greeks said they can't learn Torah. And all the Greeks, every time the Greeks would come and catch them learning Torah, they'd pull out a dreidel and say, "No, we were just gambling." Hide the Gemaras, pull out the dreidel, and say, "Well, we were just gambling. We weren't learning Torah." And there's this pseudo history to the dreidel that they'll teach in yeshivas today, that it was a ploy to trick the Greeks. The Greeks thought we were learning. No, we were just gambling, and it was completely a a ploy to trick the Greeks. So where does that story come from? So credit goes to the crew at the Sfarim blog. The crew at the internet sleuths at the Sfarim blog figured it out, and they tracked it down to a certain rabbi, I should say reverend, he calls himself Reverend, Abraham Eliezer Hershowitz. Abraham Eliezer Hershowitz was a rabbi in Pittsburgh in the early 1900s. He actually was from, I think he was from Vilna, and he published a book called Eitzer Kol Minhagei Yeshurun, like a compilation of all the minhagim of from Germany. His Sefer wasn't received so positively. I mean, he first published it in Vilna, then he republished it when he got to Pittsburgh. He published it a few times. He's a bit eccentric. Like he'll write minhagim which are completely, to use Sfarim blog's words, hallucinatory. For example, April Fools, he believes, is a minig Yisrael, and he'll say that davening is from the word for dawn in English, and all sorts of random, odd minhagim that he brings in his Sefer Minhagim. Nevertheless, he writes his entry in Eitzer Kol Minhagei Yeshurun for the dreidel is the first time in writing anybody ever wrote something about this story. And he indeed writes this story. He says the Jews used to learn in small groups and they'd huddle together because they learned Torah Sheba'al Peh, and the dreidel, they'd pull out a dreidel to devise to fool the Greeks. And where does he know this from? Well, he says he heard it from a guy who heard it from a guy. He says he heard from Rabbi Sivitz. Rabbi Sivitz was the other rabbi in Pittsburgh. This is a still from the video. He has a family video on YouTube. Rav Moshe Shimon Sivitz was the main Orthodox Rav of Pittsburgh, and everyone knows Pittsburgh was a very reform Jewish town. You could see even his family members don't look like they're religious anymore. However, he himself was a staunch anti-reform rabbi. And Rabbi Sivitz, who was also from Lita, Rabbi Sivitz told this to him, b'shem a Rabbi Karelinstein in Lumza in Poland. Now, Rabbi Karelinstein in Poland, this is a picture of his son, or of Do Tzvi. Rabbi Karelinstein was nifter in like the 1870s. So essentially, I heard it from a guy who heard it from a guy. This is beautiful, typical hearsay. Never, ever before in 2,200 years of the Chanukah story has anybody given such a explanation or has anyone ever conjured up such a history? The gambling of the dreidel that is part of Judaism instead of just German and European culture, and B, that there was some story with the Greeks that the Greeks were so naive and the Jews were so clever with their whole dreidel ploy. All of that is very much a hearsay, fully unsupportable theory or story that comes from this Eitzer Kol Minhagei Yeshurun, and he says he heard it from a rabbi who heard it from a rabbi. So take that for what it's worth. My personal opinion of this is that nothing good ever comes from teaching things that are not true to our children, and we have a responsibility as parents and educators to exploit the naivete of our children for good, not for bad. So I don't think that anything good ever comes from spreading a story that simply wasn't true. One of the commenters on this forum blog said, "Hey, does anybody know how the story went from this book to become so popular in America? Like, why did it start getting taught in day schools?" And then he posts his question, and 3 hours later, whoever this guy is, he clearly spent hours sleuthing this. 3 hours later, he's like, "I think it's from a tape from Label Varstock." Like there was a children's tape that they played in the yeshivas a lot, and some guy put it in his tape, and that's where it spread. It's an interesting theory. I can't verify it, but it's a lot of fun. Anyway, number 2, the Book of Judith. This is another myth of Hanukkah. The Book of Judith is not part of our Jewish canon. It is very highly regarded by the Catholic Church. It is a book that our earliest copies of are in Greek, but it is not part of our official Jewish canon. And many people associate the Book of Judith with Hanukkah because there's so many Greek names in it, and it speaks about, it mentions Antiochus and here and there. But what's the truth about the Book of Judith? The truth is that it is most likely a work reflective of the time of the Persian rule of Eretz Yisrael, not the Seleucid rule of Eretz Yisrael. And if you look at the real versions of Sefer Yehudis, it starts off Vahi b'shna shteimasar lemelech Nebuchadnezzar, right? It doesn't have Halifornis, who's like a Persian name, comes way later. It basically goes over 5 centuries of history in Eretz Yisrael, and it seems to be mostly an imaginary tale. Most of it is borrowing different themes from different parts of Tanakh, and it borrows names from different cities in Tanakh and different areas of the history of Eretz Yisrael. It's a very hodgepodge work. It appears to the simple understanding of Sefer Yehudas is that it's a work of fiction. It is only the Catholic Church which really believes that it must be true, but it's deeply historically troubling. Like that's the Catholic Church's opinion on Sefer Yehudas. The Jewish people have never taken Sefer Yehudas very seriously. Yes, the Rishonim quoted here and there, but they very much quote it skeptically. If you look at the Orchos Chaim also, he says, V'yesh Mefarshim. Some people bring down the Sagada of this Jewish woman named Yehudis, and possibly it was associated with the Hanukkah story. However, it probably has nothing to do with Hanukkah. It probably has nothing to do with a Greek general or the Greek era whatsoever. Yes, how did the Jews start? How did the Jewish people begin to think that it has something to do with Hanukkah? The answer is very simple. The earliest versions we have of it are from the Septuagint. They were in Greek, and there's like 4 copies of it, by the way. The Jews received the Jews of Europe, of Ashkenazi Europe, received the Sefer Yehudis from the Vulgate, which is Jerome's copy, which he claims to have copied from Aramaic. Clearly, all the Hebrew versions are based on the Vulgate. Now, even though the Vulgate's not the earliest version, as far as we could tell. Now, from the Vulgate, the Jews copied it into Hebrew. From there, they started amending it and changing it to add more Greek stuff than Persian stuff. Like instead of Ahibi Mei Nebuchadnezzar, it begins with Ahibi Mei Melech Halifornis. Or there's all sorts of very interesting versions that they did and changed. Even though clearly their base text was the Vulgate, they've changed it over the generations to many different nuschais, where they made it sound like much more of a Hanukkah story than it was in actual apocrypha, which is exactly what it is. And it's a weird story, frankly. I mean, if you read it, it's not very exciting. It's very long. There's a woman whose name is Jewess, Yehudit, and she's a virgin, a Betula from the town of Betulia, right? A Betula from virgin from Virginia, so to speak. In another version, she's a widow. In another version, I should say, of the story, she's a widow. All sorts of interesting ways to paint this tall tale. The reason it's kind of important is because the Ramah brings from the Orchos Chaim and the Ran that there is a minhag Yisrael to eat cheese on Hanukkah. Why? Well, probably maybe because the miracle of Judith happened where she fed Halifornis cheese and wine to make him tired, and just like Yael did in Shaftim, and then she killed Halifornis. I'm assuming my audience is somewhat familiar with the Book of Judith. Now, the problem with that is that it never says in Sefer Yehudas in any of the versions, it never says she fed him cheese. Sorry to burst anybody's bubble. It never says that anywhere. And already I think the Achronim point this out. They're like, well, it doesn't say it, but maybe they just learned from Yael. Like maybe they just thought it. They don't really know what's going on. Like it's really none of the versions say anything about Gavina, but they just assume, just like Yael did it, she did it too. Let's eat cheese on Hanukkah. Interesting. The history of that minhag is going to remain a mystery, but the Book of Yehudis probably has nothing to do with Hanukkah. It is probably a work of fiction. If there's any kernel of truth to it, then it's just reflective of what a Greek writing author thought in the 2nd century BC. Okay, number 3 is Antiochus the villain. When we, as Henry Abramson says, when we were in 3rd grade, we all learned a very, Professor Henry Abramson likes to point out that we were in 3rd grade, we all learned the story of Hanukkah, but we can't remain with a 3rd grade understanding of the story of Hanukkah forever. And most of our 3rd grade education is that Antiochus was this very bad Greek general. They took over Eretz Yisrael, and when they conquered Eretz Yisrael, they made all these harsh decrees. You can't learn Torah. You can't, he brought a pig in the Beis HaMikdash, and he defiled the Beis HaMikdash, and he made many harsh decrees: no Shabbos, no Rosh Chodesh, no Bris Milah. What a bad kingdom! What an evil empire! What an evil man! And it was Matisyahu and Yehuda and the Maccabeim who got together and they said, no, we're going to expel these invaders. We're going to take these bad guys, kick them out, and we're going to restore the religious theocracy to Eretz Yisrael the way it's supposed to be. And that's the story we were taught in 3rd grade, but we cannot remain with that story because that is completely a myth. What actually happened is much less pleasant, and it's something we have to learn as adults, and that is that the story of Hanukkah was not a Greco-Jewish war at all. It is not called the Greco-Jewish War. It is the Maccabean Revolt. Unlike the Roman Jewish War much later, this is the Maccabean Revolt. And it was not at all directed towards the Greeks. The war that happened during Hanukkah was a civil war, not a Greco-Jewish war. And this is important because if you read Maccabees 1 and Maccabees 2, which are contemporaneous texts, which are written by people who were there and knew the history firsthand. When you read the story of Hanukkah from firsthand witnesses, or at least almost contemporaneous sources, it is very much a civil war of a lot of bloodshed and a lot of mistakes made by both sides. And this was a civil war with Jews killing Jews, and it was horrible. The war was first civil, and the defiling of the Beis Hamikdash was first done by the Hellenist Jews well before Antiochus ever got involved. Now, the story of Antiochus getting involved was a flashpoint. However, the revolt didn't start immediately after this flashpoint. It is well known that Antiochus was a bit of a madman. He called himself Epiphanes, but behind his back, they called him Epimanes. Epiphanes means like God-given, but Epimanes means the nutcase, the madman. He had a very troubled childhood. He was a Seleucid prince who was brought up in captivity among the Romans. And when he finally became king, long story short, he was once on a campaign to Egypt to go conquer Egypt. Hey, I really want to conquer Egypt. The Romans intercepted. They said, absolutely not. You are not going to conquer Egypt. And they threatened him, and he was humiliated, and he turned around and had to leave. Now, on his way back, he heard about something happening in Judea. Now, in Eretz Yisrael, what was happening was the Greeks didn't really care about local politics. As long as they got their taxes, they were happy. They didn't care. They didn't want civil war because an empire doesn't want internal unrest. It shows that the empire is weak. But they were just going to side with the stronger side and end the civil war. That's the way the Greeks were going to do things. Now, with Antiochus in particular, he went ahead and got rid of the Kohen Gadol, who was a tzaddik, Chunya. He was not a Hellenist, and he replaced him with somebody named Jason. Jason was a Hellenist Jew who took a Greek name, Jason, and he replaced him because Jason bribed him. And then Menelaus wanted to kick out Jason, so he sieged Yerushalayim to try to kick out Jason. He failed. Basically, Antiochus is on his way back from Egypt. He's humiliated. He's furious. He's a weirdo. Look him up. Professor Henry Abramson has a lot of very good classes on this history of Hanukkah. I would recommend you go check them. But on his way back, he finds that Jason was deposed, and he finds that there's a fight in Jerusalem, and he's furious. And he's like, what is these? They didn't really understand. The Greeks didn't really understand Jews. They didn't care. They didn't understand your weird religion. He's like, what in the world is going on? He was furious, and he decided to, anything that the Greeks considered weird that the Jews were doing, he decided to defile. You guys do bris milah, which is very anti-Greek. That's going to be usher. Shabbos, that's going to be usher. Don't be lazy. You have to work on Shabbos. Rish Chodesh, you have all your calendar. That's going to be usher. We're going to sanction Jerusalem. And frankly, the Seleucid Empire themselves were not happy with him. This is completely out of character for an Assyrian Greek monarch to do such a thing. Typically, they left regions to their own devices. A region could do with their own thing. They were polytheists. Like, anyone can have their own god. That's fine. And what do you call it? His behavior, Antiochus's behavior, and his flare-up and his flashpoint, that when he defiled and ransacked Yerushalayim and the Beis Hamikdash, was very much a flare-up and a problem. But it wasn't the first time someone had defiled the Beis Hamikdash or brought in Avodah Zarah. The Hellenists had done that even before that, and it wasn't what got the Maccabees all riled up. Antiochus was a bad man. Antiochus was a weirdo. And the Greeks themselves, as a Greek empire, however, were not the villains here. The Greek empire themselves were not interested in a fight. We're not interested in doing all these laws against the Jews. And it seemed to be that they were going to have a status quo very soon. Like the Greek diplomats were convinced, they're able to solve this problem and undo all those xeris. That wasn't the hard part. Especially the Jews in the countryside really there was no enforcement in the countryside. Anyone who was not in Yerushalayim was not going to keep any of these decrees. That wasn't a problem for them. It really flared up in Modi'in. If you learn the Sefer HaMaccabim, there was a local fight where a couple of people wanted to go bring a pig as a karban. Matisyahu Banav got so offended that they said, "Oh yeah, we're going to bring you as a karban," and they murdered the person. From there, it flared up, and they began a Mila Hashem Elai campaign of guerrilla fighters. They first attacked Hellenist Jews, and they started killing them. Then they attacked Greeks, and then it got even worse and worse. The miracle was that a small ragtag army of a few thousand people at most defeated armies of tens of thousands of Greeks, which is a tremendous miracle. And it's almost like the Yom Kippur War today. And they stood for what they believed was right, and they weren't perfect, but this war was clearly a miraculous war, and their victories were demonstrably miraculous. And I wouldn't say beyond Teva, but in the kind of way where you could think of the 6-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, as being miraculous in the very same way. It was astonishing to the Jews and non-Jews alike that such a victory happened. So that was essentially the nace of Hanukkah. And Antiochus, honestly, even the Maccabees did some things that were very questionable, and the history there is complicated on both sides. But first and foremost, Antiochus is not the villain of Hanukkah. He was a villain. He is not the bad guy. It was not a Greco-Jewish war. It was a civil war among the Jews. And that's a myth of Hanukkah that has to be dispelled. It was the Hellenist Jews that were really fighting the Maccabees, and they were who they won over, not quite the Greek Empire. It wasn't until later that Yehuda Maccabi became much more nationalist and even caused division in his own ranks that it became a little bit Greco-Jewish, and then he was killed. Once he tried taking the fight directly to the Greeks, he was killed. Okay, myth number 4, praying for miracles. This one I love. This is one of my favorite myths. This one is that it is usher to daven for a nace. However, on Hanukkah, you're allowed to daven for a nace. This is something Hasidic Rebbes like to talk about, and it's a beautiful idea, and it's very attractive when you hear it at first. But it's much more complicated than that, and it all begins with the Gemara in Brachas. The Gemara in Brachas says like this. This is a Mishnah really. A person whose wife is expecting, and he says, may it be God's will that my wife give birth to a male child. This is a tfilat shav. The Mishnah says a person cannot pray for what is in the past. If his wife is pregnant, it's either a boy or a girl. Finished. You can't pray that it should be changed into a boy or a girl. That's not appropriate. And the Mishnah seems to assume praying for something to happen in the future, that's appropriate. Paying for something in the past, that is not appropriate. Doesn't say why. The Gemara asks, is prayer in that case not effective? The Gemara brings a raya from Leah. We know that by Leah, I'm just going to paraphrase here. She called her daughter Dina. Why? Because she wanted her name to be Dina because she made a judgment that it wouldn't be appropriate for her to have another boy because that would embarrass Rachel. Therefore, she prayed to Hashem to change her fetus from a boy to a girl, and it happened. Vatikrat Shema Dina, and she called her Dina because her judgment was correct. So the Gemara's first answer is Ein maskirin mas anisim. True, Dina prayed to change her fetus from a boy to a girl, but we don't bring a raya from Nisim. That was a miracle. You can't bring a raya from there. The next answer of the Gemara, which I don't have on the screen here, is that, well, it was within 40 days. Within 40 days, it's still in a nebulous period. This is actually scientifically true. Within the first 40 days, the chromosome Y have not yet selected. There hasn't yet been a full selection, whether it's going to be a boy or a girl. After 40 days, it's already been selected, and therefore you cannot pray for it. Now, nowhere here in the Gemara does it say that you're not allowed to pray for miracles. It doesn't criticize Leah for davening for a miracle. It just says you cannot bring a raya from a miracle. One could infer from this Gemara, perhaps, that because praying for the past is taken as granted that you can't do that, it must be that praying for the past is, in and of itself, praying for a miracle. It's an interesting idea. And it's possible. There's also a Gemara in Tainus which says a person should not put himself into a makam sakana because if he does get saved b'derech nes, then that would minus from his merits. Doesn't say you can't pray for a miracle though. So this Gemara was taken as a basis for the objection, so to speak, of the Talmud of the Gemara for praying for miracles, even though it's not clear cut. Now, this comes to a head. This comes to a head when we approach the Ramah. The Ramah in Reish Pei Beis, I believe it is. The Ramah says that a person should, if he forgets al nisim and berachas hamatzon, should say Rachaman hu yasal anu nisim. I forgot the exact nusach, but it essentially says that Hashem should, just like you did nisim for our parents, al nisim al porkan, so too should you do nisim for us. And all the achrayim ask on the Ramah, how could you daven for nisim? The Gemara says you can't daven for nisim. So there's all sorts of answers given. Well, maybe biyachid is different. Yachid and Sibor. If you're asking for the call, you can ask, or maybe it's an exception on Hanukkah, or we're not asking for an ace that's shaloi kederach hateva. We're asking for an ace which is b'derech hateva. We're not asking for an ace of the pach shemen. We're asking for an ace like the malchama, something that's statistically improbable, right? Like we say in Vayidim al nisech sheb'chayim manu. All sorts of answers are given. What's really strange about these questions is that whoever's asking these questions clearly didn't see the Torah. The Torah and the Shulchan and really Beis Yosef discuss at length the older Nusach of Al Hanisim. In the Nusach of Bimei Matityahu, that was basically universal during the Middle Ages. At the end of Bimei Matityahu, it said Kashem Shasita Lanu Nisim Kashasita Nisim Lavotenu Kenyasa Nisim Lanu. At the end of Al Hanisim, everybody in Klal Yisrael said, well, not everybody, many people in Klal Yisrael said this language. It's just like you did Nisim for our forefathers, so too should you do Nisim for us. And the Rishonim don't have a problem with that nusach. They don't look at that nusach and say, well, you can't daven for Nisim. Their whole problem with adding that, the Maram and the Rush, they don't like adding it personally. Their own personal minhag was not to add it because they didn't like asking for bakasha in the bracha of Hoda'ah. It's a technical thing. You don't ask for bakashot in Modim. They had a technical problem with it. They had no problem with the language. The Rishonim don't seem to have ever had a problem with praying for miracles. And therefore, what do you call it? I think it's kind of odd that people really ask on the Ramah. The Ramah is not, why is your problem with the Ramah? The Ramah is not, in my view, I don't see that. That doesn't make any sense. The Ramah is not the first person to have such a nusach. All of Klal Yisrael had this nusach. It's only when the Shulchan Aruch came out and said he preferred not to say it that everybody stopped saying it. So that's my personal opinion. I think it's a bit of a I think it's a bit of a misnomer that people cannot daven for nisim. You don't have to be a theological giant to understand that it's a little bit foolish to pray for nisim. If you have an empty sack and you say, God, I wish you to fill it with coins or change my potatoes into gold coins. I mean, most people understand that Hashem wants to conduct the world al pi derech hateva. He wants to conduct the world through the laws of nature. He doesn't want to conduct the world with explicit radical nisim. And so most people don't assume that you could just pray to Hashem for a nace to happen to you. Perhaps in desperation, like by the Yam Suf, perhaps if you have no other choice, or if it's for a tzibur or some other exception, perhaps it would be appropriate to daven for an ace. I don't believe it is appropriate to daven for an ace in most cases. I don't know if it's usher, and I don't know if it's completely not allowed. I've heard, like, for example, in Eitzah, one Rav said that if you I forgot who this was. But anyway, one Paisik said, well, if you have somebody who's very sick and al pi derech hateva, they're dead already. Like, let's say someone has very far advanced in cancer. There's no way al pi derech hateva that they'll ever live. Instead of davening that they should get better, you could daven that someone will find a miraculous cure. You could always find ways around this problem about praying for miracles. So I thought that was interesting. And that is one of the myths that you cannot daven for miracles. I don't think it's completely true. There's no isser, and the Rishonim never seem to have a problem with that language whatsoever. It's just, theologically, I think, obvious to most people. Now, the miracle of the oil. Here's the last one. This is the Nes Pach Shemen. Most people assume the Nes Pach Shemen is the reason why we celebrate Chanukah. What happened? Well, let's see the Gemara. The Gemara says in Brachot, in Shabbat of Chafalafum Bet, it says, "My Chanukah, the Tanu Rabbanan, we learned in a Braita." Let's read this together. 25th of Kislev is the day when you can't do Tanit, you can't do Hesped, right? And when the Yavanim came into the Heichal, they defiled all of the oils. When the kingdom of Hashmonai took over, they're referencing them as the Malchut, even though at the time they were not yet a Malchut. Nitzchum, and they won. Batku v'lo matzu ala pach echad. They only found one jug of oil. They looked around. They only found one jug. Shel shemen shayta munach b'chotamo shel Kohen Gadol, which still had the seal of the Kohen Gadol, and they knew it was tahar. V'lo haya bo elo lehadlik yom echad. They only had enough to light for one night, for one day. Nasa bones. There was a miracle. V'hidliku mimenu shemona yamim, and they lit for it for 8 days. L'shana acheret, the following year, kavum ba'asum yamim tovim b'halal ba'alda'ah. The following year, they made this a Yom Tov for Halal and Hoda'ah. Clearly, Talmud Bavli, what do we got? This seems to be a Talmud Bavli, which tells us the miracle of Chanukah is explained with the nace of the Pach Shemen. However, mysteriously, if you look in Al Anisim, it says nothing about the nace Pach Shemen. And if you look in the Tefillah, we don't seem to make, and if we look at even the halachas of lighting the nerais or saying Hallel, the institution of the nace of the Chag of Hanukkah is not really, as far as we can tell from the rest of the words of Chazal, has not much to do with the nace of the Pach Shemen. It has much more to do with the nace of the Milchama. It has much more to do with the nace of the war. So why is it that this nace of Pach Shemen gained such traction? So first of all, we have to take this Gemara in context. The Gemara is saying Tanu Rabbanan, and where is it quoting this brisa from? It's quoting it from Megillat Ta'anit. Megillat Ta'anit is a brita of a table. It has a table of all sorts of days where you cannot say fast and you cannot give hespedim. Now, the way Megillat Ta'anit developed is that it started off with just the table, and then it had scholia, different writers who wrote different additions to it throughout the ages. And if you look at the brisa here with me on the page, you'll notice that it starts off in Aramaic and then it switches to Hebrew, right? My Chanukah, right? So this is the first scholia. Tarabaran, it says that's Aramaic. Then it switches to Hebrew because this is somebody else writing, etc. So the Gemara received Megillat Ta'anit already with what's it called, changes to it, and this is already in the 4th century. The Gemara is receiving Megillat Ta'anit with changes to it. And just to give you context, the miracle of Hanukkah happened at least, I think, 550 years before the Gemara was finally fixed. So this brings this entire story into question. Why is Talmud Bavli the only place that we find such an ace? We don't find it in Maccabees 1. We don't find it in Maccabees 2. We don't find it in Miguel Santiaches. Sorry, I should say that. We don't find it in Al Anisim. We don't find it in any other source. Basically, any source, and Shulamit Elisor points this out, any source that's from Eretz Yisrael, you simply do not find the nace of the Pach Shemen. If you look at Yushalmi, if you look at Medrash, if you look at Mishnah, you look at Tosefta, if you look at the Piyutim from Eretz Yisrael all the way to the 9th century, none of the Jews who lived in Eretz Yisrael or the Jews who followed Talmud Yushalmi had ever heard of the nace Pach Shemen. Look at the Piyutim of Elazar HaKalir. He never once mentions the nace Pach Shemen, and he knows the entire story of Hanukkah because, to be frank, it's very hard from the words of Chazal to find throughout Chazal to find anything about the story of Hanukkah and the Hashmonaim and the Yevanim, the Misyavnim. All that history is scattered throughout the works of Chazal. And Kalir brings them all in one piyut. All the other piyutim are much more involved in talking about the Chanukah of the Beit HaMikdash or the Malchiot. Kalir is the only one of the Paitanim from Eretz Yisrael who says, no, let me actually review the story of the nace of Hanukkah. And he goes through the whole thing. The Paitan goes through everything. Not once, even though he's familiar with every corner of Chazal, he never brings Talmud Bavli. He never brings the nace of the Pach Shemen because he was trained under Talmud Yerushalmi. Maybe one time in his life he got his hands on the Talmud Bavli. I don't know. But none of the Yidden who lived under the rule of Eretz Yisrael had ever heard of the nace Pach Shemen. And that is why Al Anisim and Bimei Matityahu don't have the nace of the Pach Shemen. And that is why Kenise Pilaecha, also the version of the Bnei Eretz Yisrael for Al Anisim, also doesn't have the nace of the Pach Shemen because they had never heard of it. It is simply part of the Talmud Bavli. So if it's not the nace Pach Shemen, why do we keep Hanukkah for 8 days? The kasha only gets stronger. If it's not if Talmud Bavli is the only place where we have this nace Pach Shemen, right? And nobody else believed in it, then why do we keep Hanukkah for 8 days? The answer is probably 2 parts. Number 1, the Gemara. Number 2, the Sefer Maccabim 2. If you look at the second book of Maccabees, it says here that after they did the Chanukah Sabayith, they celebrated a festival just like Sukkot. What happened? They missed Sukkot that year because the temple was banned. The Mikdash was closed down by the Greeks. They celebrated when they couldn't. They remember the previous days when they were able to celebrate in the festival of Sukkot in the mountains and in the caves, and they were out in the desolation. And they took the willows of the brook. They basically did a makeup holiday. They did a makeup Sukkot. Ve'yaviu kol b'kol arei Yehuda. They sent an announcement to all the cities of Yehuda lachog et hachag hazeh midei shana b'shana, to celebrate this chag every year. This is a source which is only a few decades, I believe it's a few decades after the story of Chanukah took place. Their information was clearly pretty good. And their version of the story is the reason we keep 8 days is because they did a makeup holiday. The Chanukah Sameach was 8 days Keneged Sukkot. This explains Beis Shammai in the Gemara. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about, this is a light bulb moment. The Gemara says that there's a machlekes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Do we add Nerais? 1, 2, 3, 4. So are we mosif v'holech or pochet v'holech? Right? There's different versions of each, different versions of understanding the machloket. In one of the versions of Beit Shammai, the Gemara says, why are we pochet v'holech? Why is it that we do less every night? The Gemara says, kineged parei hachag. It's corresponding the cows of Sukkot. Every day of Sukkot, we bring one less cow as a korban in the Beit HaMikdash. So too, on Chanukah, we do one less ner every night. It sounds explicitly like Beit Shammai held that the reason we kept 8 days of Chanukah is because it corresponds to Sukkot. And because it's corresponding to the Sukkot and the Neirot are representative of Parot HaChag, therefore we do one less every night. On the other hand, you have works like, let's say, Josephus, which is, I think, 100, 200 years more after the Nes of Chanukah. Josephus relies on book 1 of Maccabees. He says, I heard it was called Chag HaOrim, the Festival of Lights, but I don't know why. Clearly, there was another faction of Jews who associated it with light, and they didn't know why. So it's very likely that there was a Mesorah, there was a tradition among the Jews of this Nes Pach Shemen that carried all the way to the time of the Gemara. Now, Megillas Antiochus does mention the Nes Pach Shemen, but it's probably composed in the 9th century, so 1,000 years after. Megillas Antiochus is very late. It's probably 1,000 years after the Nes of Chanukah. So it's only when, for example, the Paitanim of Eretz Yisrael, after they received the Megillas Antiochus in like the 10th century, when they were familiar with it, then they start writing piyutim about the Nes Pach Shemen. But before they had Megillas Antiochus, they never got it. So it sounds like Beis Hillel learned that the Nes Pach Shemen is why we keep 8 days of Chanukah, and that's the reason why we're mosif v'holech. But Beis Shammai held the reason we keep 8 days of Chanukah is because they were paralleling Sukkot, and therefore we should minus 1 ner every single night. So that is the great myth of the jug of the oil. It is not the reason why we celebrate Chanukah. The real reason for the Nes, as Al Hanisa makes clear, is the incredible miracle for those who stood up for Hashem and were able to win against incredible odds. The Nes of the Pach Shemen is an explanation why this holiday was chosen to be 8 days long, rather than why we celebrate Hanukkah to begin with. It is one of 2 explanations that were popular in Gaonic times. So thank you to everybody for your time and attention. This has been 5 Chanukah Myths. Hashem, next week we will continue with our regular shir on Tefillah, and I hope everybody enjoyed.